can buy almost anything. A mansion overlooking rolling hill, a family name engraved into hospitals, universities, and museum walls, a reputation so carefully protected that it appears untouchable. But there is one thing wealth has never been able to purchase: silence inside the human mind. For generations, the world's oldest fortunes have perfected the art of looking untouched by chaos. Every photograph is immaculate, every dinner party effortless, every public appearance another reminder that some families seem immune to the struggles that define ordinary lives. At least that's the story. The truth is often much quieter. Behind polished portraits, handwritten family crests, and centuries-old estates are stories that were never meant to leave the walls that protect them. This is one of those stories, not about money, not about privilege, but about the invisible cost of spending generations pretending everything is fine. Because sometimes the greatest inheritance family passes down isn't wealth, it's silence. And sometimes silence becomes addiction. The Calderwood estate sits quietly among the hills of Connecticut, hidden behind iron gates and ancient oak trees that have watched generations come and go. The house is magnificent, stone walls weathered by 2 centuries, towering windows, hand-carved staircases, rooms filled with paintings of ancestors whose expressions never seem to change. Nothing feels accidental. Every flower is trimmed, every painting perfectly aligned, every antique polished until it reflects a version of the family the world expects to see. Perfection isn't decoration, it's tradition. Above the entrance are 2 Latin words: semper immota, always unmoved. No one alive remembers who chose those words. No one remembers when they first appeared, but everyone understands what they mean. Feel nothing, reveal nothing, protect everything. That philosophy shaped every generation that followed, not through lectures, not through written rules, but through thousands of quiet moments that slowly taught every child exactly what was expected of them. Speak carefully, stand straight, never lose your composure, never embarrass the family, especially in public. Because in families like this, reputation isn't earned, it's inherited, and every generation is expected to return it in better condition than they received it. Every morning begins exactly the same. Breakfast appears at precisely 7:15. Silverware sits perfectly aligned. Fresh flowers arrive before anyone enters the dining room. Coffee is poured while it's still hot. The routine has remained almost unchanged for decades. Some mornings, nobody touches the food. No one comments. No one asks why. The plates disappear exactly as they arrive, silently. The house has become remarkably good at pretending nothing unusual has happened. It always has, because pretending eventually becomes easier than asking difficult questions, especially questions whose answers threaten the image everyone has spent generations protecting. A longtime friend of the family once said something impossible to forget. Nobody ever taught them how to fall apart. They were only taught how to look like they hadn't. That single sentence explains more about old money than almost any balance sheet ever could. Most people inherit homes. Some inherit businesses. Families like the Calderwoods inherit expectation, and expectations can become astonishingly heavy. Years before anyone noticed the addiction, there was a photograph, a ribbon-cutting ceremony, children dressed in matching coats, smiling politely beside local politicians. Among them stood one boy, perfect posture, hands folded neatly in front of him, looking exactly where he had been taught to look. Except his eyes were somewhere else. Nobody noticed. Or perhaps they noticed and decided not to. Remember those hands? We'll come back to them. Every great family has rules. Some are written, most are not. The Calderwoods had one rule that outweighed all the others. A Calderwood does not embarrass another Calderwood. It was never carved into stone. It never appeared inside the family archive. No one remembers hearing it spoken aloud, yet everyone obeyed it. Children understood it before they understood inheritance. Adults enforced it without realizing they were doing so. It appeared in small moments: a look across the dinner table, a conversation ending too quickly, an uncomfortable subject replaced by weather, politics, or charity work. Eventually, silence became the family's native language. Every old family also has names that quietly disappear, relatives whose photographs remain displayed, but whose stories slowly vanish from conversation. The Calderwoods had several. People weren't forgotten. They were simply edited. History has always been kinder than memory, especially when powerful families are writing both. In the library stood an old crystal whiskey decanter, heavy, elegant, timeless. It had occupied the exact same position for over 60 years. Nobody questioned it. Nobody remembered buying it. Nobody asked why it was always full. One former estate manager admitted something curious years later. Part of his job wasn't simply maintaining the house, it was making sure the decanter never appeared empty whenever photographers visited. No one explained why, he simply understood that appearances mattered. Much later, he realized the decanter wasn't decoration, it was camouflage. Sometimes symbols hide in plain sight for decades before anyone understands what they were actually hiding. Eleanor Calderwood understood that better than anyone. Every morning she passed 12 generations of painted ancestors without looking directly at a single portrait. Not because she disliked them, because she already knew exactly what they expected from her. Composure, grace, control. Above all, control. She had spent decades mastering those expectations until they became impossible to separate from her own identity. One morning she paused in the library. The whiskey decanter caught the early sunlight. She looked at it for several long seconds, not long enough for anyone else to notice, just long enough for memory to speak louder than silence. Then she straightened a stack of magazines that didn't need straight and continued with her day. That tiny gesture revealed something extraordinary. Composure is rarely the absence of emotion. emotion. More often, it's the ability to hide emotion so completely that even the person carrying it begins to believe it's gone. But hidden emotions don't disappear, they simply wait. Sometimes for years, sometimes for generations, and eventually they find somewhere else to live. That somewhere was Julian Calderwood. Julian Calderwood was everything the family had spent generations trying to create. 31 years old, impeccably dressed, educated at the finest school, comfortable in any boardroom, welcome at every charity gala, the future of a family whose name opened doors before he ever reached them. To the outside world, he looked effortless, the kind of man who never stumbled, never doubted, never lost control. But appearances can become dangerous when people begin believing, because the more perfect the image becomes, the harder it is to admit you're suffering behind it. Every morning, Julian woke 15 minutes before the rest of the house, not because he loved discipline, because he needed time to become the version of himself everyone expected to see. The mirror reflected a man with perfect posture, perfect grooming, perfect confidence. But before adjusting his tie, before buttoning his jacket, before stepping into another carefully choreographed day, there was always the arithmetic. Not business, not investment, not family finances, drinks. How many last night? How many bottles remained hidden? How many hours until another drink would seem socially acceptable? How many people would notice? How many wouldn't? Addiction rarely arrives like a thunderstorm. It arrives like a habit, quiet, reasonable, almost polite. It convinces you that you are still in control. Until one day, you realize you're organizing your entire life around something you still insist isn't a problem. Julian called it discipline. The addiction called it dependent. Only one of them was telling the truth. Downstairs, breakfast unfolded with its usual precision. Fresh coffee, pressed linen, silver polished to perfection. Julian rarely ate, complimented his mother's roses instead, even when they weren't in season. She thanked him, even though she knew they weren't. Neither corrected the other, because correcting something so small might accidentally lead to discussing something much larger. Families don't always avoid difficult conversations because they don't care. Sometimes they avoid them because they're terrified of where honesty might lead. Silence can feel safer than truth until it isn't. A college friend remembered Julian differently. He described someone who could charm absolutely anyone. Professors, journalists, donors, complete strangers. People left conversations feeling they'd met someone unusually genuine. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that charm eventually became Julian's solution for everything. Need to avoid a difficult question? Smile. Need to leave a conversation early? Smile. Need to convince yourself everything is fine? Smile. Charm became armor, and like all armor, it protected him from pain. It also prevented anyone from reaching him. Eventually, even the people who loved him most weren't speaking to Julian anymore. They were speaking to the performance. The whiskey glass on his desk always looked ordinary. Crystal, elegant, half full. Sometimes untouched for hours, sometimes replaced before anyone noticed. Visitors assumed it belonged there because wealthy homes often display expensive liquor. No one wondered how often it was actually being used. Only Julian knew the difference between decoration and necessity. The house had a comforting phrase for it. An early nightcap, a way to unwind, taking the edge off. Families have an extraordinary talent for inventing softer words when reality becomes too uncomfortable. Addiction became stress, dependence became routine, concern became privacy. The vocabulary changed, the truth didn't. Then there was the medicine cabinet, hidden inside a guest bathroom that looked as though nobody had opened it in years. Everything inside appeared ordinary. Painkillers, bandages, antiseptic, a forgotten bottle of aspirin. Behind them, wrapped carefully inside an old embroidered towel, a small orange prescription bottle. Its label had faded almost completely. The name wasn't Julian. It belonged to a long-time family friend, a trusted physician, someone who had quietly helped the family for decades. Looking back, he admitted something difficult. He believed he was protecting them, protecting their privacy, protecting their dignity, protecting the family from unnecessary public attention. Years later, he wondered if what he'd actually protected was the addiction itself. Discretion is a beautiful quality, until discretion begins replacing honesty. Then it becomes something else entirely. Eleanor knew the bottle was there. She had always known. She never touched it. She never threw it away. She simply closed the cabinet each time she saw it. Some people imagine denial as refusing to see the truth. Real denial is often much quieter. It's seeing everything, understanding everything, and convincing yourself that today simply isn't the day to confront it. Tomorrow becomes next week becomes next year. Eventually, years disappear. Problems grow silently, waiting patiently. Old money families rarely survive for centuries because they avoid mistakes. They survive because they become extraordinarily skilled at containing them. Bad investments are hidden. Family scandals disappear. Divorces become private matters. Arguments become misunderstandings. Addiction becomes exhaustion. Everything receives a new name. Everything except the pain. Pain has never cared what people call it. Once every year, Ashcombe opened its doors to the public. The annual charity gala, 300 guests, crystal chandeliers, classical music, waiters carrying silver trays through rooms lined with portraits that seemed almost alive beneath candlelight. It was the kind of evening magazines love. Elegant, refined, timeless. People walked away convinced they had witnessed one of America's last great families. What they actually witnessed was one of America's greatest performances. Julian stood before the crowd to deliver the annual speech. He had given versions of it for years. Warm, confident, self-aware. Exactly the kind of speech people expect from someone raised inside privilege. He thanked donors, celebrated the hospital, honoured his late great father. The audience applauded. Some laughed. Some wiped away tears. It was flawless. Almost. Only one person noticed what everyone else missed. His sister. Margot watched Julian's hand tighten around a champagne glass he never intended to drink from. The trembling was almost invisible. Almost. Most people wouldn't have seen it. Margot did, because she'd spent half her life learning how to recognize the smallest signs that her brother was struggling. Loving someone who's suffering teaches you strange skill. You notice pauses no one else hears. You recognize smiles that arrive half a second too late. You learn the difference between someone who's happy and someone who's simply very good at pretending. Julian finished speaking. The applause echoed through the ballroom. He sat down, beneath the white tablecloth, hidden beneath hundreds of conversations. Margot quietly reached for his hand. She didn't ask if he was okay. She already knew the answer. Sometimes love doesn't sound like advice. Sometimes it simply refuses to let go. People often imagine addiction as something loud, a public collapse, a police report, a scandal splashed across newspaper. But in families like the Calderwoods, addiction almost never arrives that way. It arrives quietly, behind closed doors, inside routines that nobody questions, wrapped in traditions that make silence feel like loyalty. And after enough years, silence begins to look exactly like. Margot understood that better than anyone. If Julian represented everything the family feared becoming, Margot represented everything they admired. Perfect grades, perfect manners, perfect reliability. She graduated at the top of her class, joined one of the country's most respected charitable foundations, never missed an event, never missed a deadline, never gave anyone a reason to worry. By every visible measure, Margot was thriving, but appearances have always been the Calderwoods' greatest talent. Long after everyone else had gone home, long after the lights across the city had disappeared, one office window remained illuminated. Margot's. She reread documents that were already finished, answered emails that didn't need immediate replies, stayed busy long after there was work to do. People called it dedication, ambition, discipline. No one called it what it sometimes was: escape. Not everyone runs toward a bottle. Some people run toward perfection. Some disappear inside work, some disappear inside achievement. The destination changes, the loneliness doesn't. A colleague remembered watching Margot excuse herself from an afternoon meeting. Her hands had begun to shake. She returned only minutes later, calm, collected, professional. The meeting continued as though nothing had happened. Nobody asked questions. Nobody wanted to embarrass her. Funny how often compassion and avoidance wear the same face. The Calderwoods had always rewarded strength. Unfortunately, they had mistaken emotional concealment for strength for generations. Margot learned that lesson early, very early, as children. She and Julian once hid beneath the dining room table during one of their parents' arguments. Guests were still upstairs. Music was still playing. Laughter still echoed through the house. Only the children knew something had changed. Julian covered his ears. Margot covered his. Neither of them cried. Neither wanted the other to become more frightened. It was a small moment, one that lasted only minutes, yet somehow it taught them everything. Protect the people you love. Protect the family's image. Protect everyone else first. Whatever remains, carry it alone. Years later, neither of them remembered exactly what the argument had been about. They only remembered the silence that followed. Sometimes children forget the words. They never forget the feeling. There was one person inside Ashcombe who witnessed more than anyone else. Grace Hale. She arrived at the estate when she was 22. She expected to stay for a summer. Instead, she spent almost 4 decades watching generations grow older inside the same walls. She polished the silver, prepared guest rooms, opened curtains every morning before sunrise, closed them every evening after sunset. People often think employees in houses like Ashcombe become invisible. The opposite is true. Invisible people notice everything. Grace watched children become adults, adults become parents, parents become portraits hanging silently in hallways. She watched birthdays, funerals, Christmas dinners, anniversaries, political fundraisers, wedding receptions, every celebration, every tragedy, always from just outside the room. Years later, she said something remarkable. People think old money means old rule. It doesn't. It means old wound, dressed beautifully. That single sentence explained Ashcombe better than any history book ever could. She often compared the family silver to the family itself. Every week she polished away the tarnish. Every week it returned. Not because she failed, because tarnish always comes back. You don't eliminate it, you simply learn how to make it less visible. Families can become exactly the same. One night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, Grace found Richard Calderwood sitting alone on the pantry floor, the powerful patriarch, the respected businessman, the generous philanthropist. Unable to stand, he looked exhausted, broken, smaller than she'd ever seen him. For a brief moment, he wasn't the head of one of America's oldest families. He was simply a man losing a battle nobody else was allowed to win. He looked at Grace, forced a tired smile, and quietly said, "I trust you'll keep the peace." Nothing more. No explanation, no apology, no conversation. Just 4 words: keep the peace. Grace helped him back to his feet. The incident was never mentioned again. Not the next morning, not the next year, not even after Richard died, because that's what Ashcombe had always done. Not solve problems, contain them. History would remember Richard as generous, disciplined, visionary, a man whose donations built hospital wings and university library. History wouldn't remember the night spent alone with a glass in his hand. History rarely remembers the parts families work hardest to erase. As the years passed, Julian slowly began believing something that wasn't true. He believed he was the first to struggle, the first to disappoint, the first to feel unable to carry the weight of family. He couldn't have been more wrong. Long Long before Julian, there had been Theodore, Richard's older brother, brilliant, charismatic, expected to inherit everything. He struggled in ways the family refused to describe. Officially, he spent time abroad. Unofficially, he disappeared. His portrait remained. His story didn't. Before Theodore, there was Constance Drummond, a great-aunt remembered only in whispers. The family said she suffered from nerves. Back then, almost every pain people didn't understand became nerves. She spent years in a private clinic overseas. Visitors became less frequent. Letters stopped arriving. Eventually, even conversations about her disappeared. One generation called it nerves, another called it stress, another called it exhaustion. Different words, the same silence, different generations, the same pain. By now, a pattern had begun to emerge. Not inherited addiction, inherited emotional survival. Generation after generation learned exactly the same lesson. Don't burden anyone, don't reveal weakness, don't become the scandal, and if the weight becomes unbearable, carry it quietly. That lesson didn't create addiction, but it built the perfect environment for addiction to hide. Because pain doesn't disappear when people stop talking about it. It simply changes where it lives, and eventually it finds someone new. For the Calderwoods, that someone was Julian. Families rarely collapse all at once. Most of the time, they crack so slowly that nobody notices until the sound becomes impossible to ignore. For the Calderwoods, that moment arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, not during a gala, not during a board meeting, not beneath the flashing lights of cameras, just an ordinary Tuesday. Margot wasn't supposed to be there. She had driven to Ashcombe on impulse, an old habit she had never quite outgrown. Sometimes she'd leave a book on the hallway table, sometimes she'd stay for breakfast, sometimes she'd leave without anyone even knowing she'd come. That morning, something felt different. The house was unusually quiet, not peaceful, quiet, the kind of silence that makes you slow your footsteps without realizing why. One light was still on. Julian's study, the same room where generations of Calderwoods had signed contracts, hosted private meetings, and quietly carried burdens no one else was allowed to see. The door was slightly open. The whiskey glass wasn't sitting neatly on the desk anymore. It was lying on the floor, empty. Margot didn't need to open the door to know something was wrong. Some instincts don't come from experience, they come from love. What she found inside changed everything. We won't describe that morning in detail. Some moments deserve more dignity than curiosity. What matters is this: Julian survived. But survival wasn't the miracle. The miracle was what happened next. Because for the first time in generations, the Calderwoods stopped protecting the image and started protecting the person. Margot reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled. She dialed her mother's number before she dialed emergency services. Later, she admitted she still thinks about choice. Not because it delayed help, but because it revealed something terrifying. Even in the middle of a family crisis, her first instinct had been to protect the family. Years of conditioning don't disappear in a single moment. They speak before you do. They decide before you think. They become reflex. When Eleanor answered the phone, she was standing in the east hallway. The same hallway she'd walked every morning for years. The same hallway lined with silent portraits. The same hallway where generations had learned to hold themselves together. For a few seconds, she didn't move. Not because she didn't understand, because she understood immediately. Then, for the first time anyone could remember, she reached for the wall. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't collapse. She didn't scream. Her hand simply searched for something solid, as if decades of composure had suddenly become too heavy to carry alone. That tiny gesture said more than words ever could. Even the strongest people eventually need something to lean on. The ambulance arrived. The estate gates opened. Secrets that had spent decades hidden behind stone walls suddenly met the outside world. Not because the family wanted them to, because reality eventually refuses to stay hidden forever. Julian spent the following weeks somewhere far removed from gala dinners, family portraits, and inherited expectations. For the first time in years, nobody asked him to represent Calderwood name. Nobody expected a speech. Nobody cared whether his tie was straight. People asked a much simpler question. How are you? It sounds ordinary, but sometimes the simplest question is the hardest one to answer. Months later, Julian reflected on that Tuesday. People kept asking what he remembered. They expected some dramatic realization, a single defining moment. Instead, he remembered something surprisingly small. For several hours, nobody was watching him. Nobody expected him to perform. Nobody expected confidence. Nobody expected perfection. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't playing a role. And strangely, that frightened him more than almost losing everything. Because if you've spent your entire life performing, who are you when the audience disappears? Ashcombe released a short public statement. It spoke of exhaustion. It requested privacy. It thanked everyone for their concern. The statement never mentioned addiction. Some words remain difficult, even after they've become impossible to ignore. Inside Eleanor's desk, several drafts of that statement still existed. One version used the word addiction, another crossed it out, a third replaced it with personal health challenges. Each draft revealed the same battle, not against public opinion, against generations of silence. For decades, the family had chosen the right words. Now, they had to choose honesty. Those are rarely the same thing. Recovery didn't transform the family overnight. Real life almost never does. Julian moved out of Ashcombe, not out of anger, not rebellion, simply because he realized he couldn't heal inside a house built around pretending. He began attending therapy. One appointment, then another, then another. Progress didn't arrive dramatic. It arrived quietly, like trust, like forgiveness, like sunrise. One ordinary morning at a time. When someone asked whether he finally had everything figured out, he laughed. No, I just have a Tuesday Tuesday appointment I haven't missed?" Then he smiled. "My mother calls every week now, and for the first time I can remember, she actually waits for my answer." That was enough. Healing rarely begins with extraordinary moments. Sometimes it begins when someone finally listens. Margot's journey proved more complicated. Everyone celebrated Julian's recovery. Few people asked how she was coping. She admitted something painfully honest. Watching her brother heal forced her to notice how exhausted she'd become herself. For years, she had measured her own worth by how much she could carry, how much she could fix, how much she could hide. She spent so long protecting everyone else, she forgot she deserved protecting too. Sometimes the invisible child grows into the invisible adult. Not because people don't love them, because they become so good at appearing strong. Nobody realizes they're drowning. Grace Hale still works at Ashcombe. Most mornings, she walks the same hallways, polishes the same silver, opens the same curtain. The house looks almost exactly as it always has. Visitors still admire its beauty. The portraits still watch from their gilded frames. The gardens remain immaculate. At first glance, nothing has changed. But houses remember, even when people pretend they don't. Every morning, Eleanor still walks the east hallway. She still passes 12 generations of Calderwood. She still rarely looks directly at the portrait, perhaps because she finally understands something they never did. Stillness is not peace. Silence is not strength. And perfection has never healed anyone. People often assume old money inherits privilege, and it does. They assume it inherits opportunity. It does that too. But families don't only inherit fortune, they inherit habits, expectations, fears, ways of loving, ways of grieving, ways of surviving, generation after generation. Those invisible inheritances shape lives far more deeply than bank accounts ever could. Money built Ashcombe, but silence built the people who lived inside it. This was never really a story about addiction. Addiction was only the symptom. The real story was about everything that came before it, the conversations that never happened, the emotions that never found words, the children who learned that composure mattered more than honesty, the parents who confused protection with silence, the generations who believed love meant carrying pain alone, because pain kept hidden doesn't disappear, it waits, patiently, quietly, until someone finally decides the inheritance ends with them. Perhaps that's the true measure of legacy, not the wealth we leave behind, but the silence we refuse to pass on. Because fortunes can build estates, reputations can survive centuries, portraits can outlive everyone who sat for them, but the greatest inheritance any family can leave is permission to tell the truth, and perhaps that is the only inheritance that can finally set the next generation free.